I'll wait till my recording. This is Frindle by Andrew Clements. The first chapter is called Nick. If you ask the kids and the teachers at Lincoln Elementary School to make 3 lists, all the really bad kids, all the really smart kids, and all the really good kids, Nick Allen would not be on any of them. Nick deserved a list all on his own, and everyone knew it. Was Nick a troublemaker? Hard to say. But one thing's for sure, Nick Allen had plenty of ideas, and he knew what to do with them. One time in 3rd grade, Nick decided to turn Miss Deaver's room into a tropical island. What kid in New Hampshire isn't ready for a little summer in February? So first he got everyone to make small palm trees out of green and brown construction paper, and he taped them to the corners of each desk. Miss Deaver had only been a teacher for about 6 months, and she was delighted. "Oh, that's so cute," she said. The next day, all the girls wore paper flowers in their hair, and all the boys wore sunglasses and beach hats. And Miss Deaver clapped her hands. "It's so colorful," she said. The day after that, Nick turned the classroom thermostat up to 90 degrees with a little screwdriver he brought from home, and all the kids changed into shorts and T-shirts with no shoes. And when Miss Deaver left the room for a minute, Nick spread about 10 cups of fine white sand all over the classroom floor. Miss Deaver was surprised again at just how creative her students could be. But the sand got tracked into the hallway, where Manny, the custodian, did not think it was creative at all, and he stomped right down to the office. The principal followed the trail of sand, and when she arrived at Miss Deaver's, she was teaching the hula to some kids near the front of the room, and a tall, thin, shirtless boy with chestnut brown hair was spiking a Nerf volleyball over a net made from 6 T-shirts they tied together. The 3rd grade trip to the South Seas ended suddenly. But that didn't stop Nick from trying to liven things up. Lincoln Elementary needed a good jolt once in a while, and Nick was just the guy to deliver it. About a year later, Nick made the great blackbird discovery. One night, he learned on a TV show that the red-winged blackbirds give this high-pitched chirp because a hawk or some other danger comes near. Because of the ways the sound travels, the bird hunters can't tell where the high-pitched chirp is coming from. The next day during silent reading, Nick glanced up at his teacher, and he noticed that Mrs. Avery's nose was curved, kind of like the beak of a hawk. So Nick let out a high-pitched, squeaky blackbird beep. Mrs. Avery jerked her head and looked around. She couldn't tell who did it, and so she just said, "Shh," to the whole class. A minute later, Nick did it again. Beep. Louder this time. This time there was some giggles from the class, but Mrs. Avery pretended not to hear the sound, and about 15 seconds later, she slowly stood up and walked to the back of the room. Without taking his eyes off his book and without moving at all, Nick put his heart and soul into the highest and most annoying cheep he could. Mrs. Avery pounced. "Janet Fisk, you stop that this instant!" Janet, who was sitting 4 rows away from Nick, promptly turned white and then bright crimson red. "But it wasn't me, honest!" There was a catch in Janet's voice like she might cry. Mrs. Avery knew she had made a mistake, and she apologized to Janet. "But someone's asking for big trouble," she said, and Mrs. Avery looked more like a hawk every second. Nick kept reading, and he didn't make another peep. At lunchtime, Nick talked to Janet. He felt bad that Mrs. Avery had pounced on her. Janet lived in Nick's neighborhood, and sometimes they played together. She was good at baseball and was better at soccer than most of the kids in the whole school, boys or girls. Nick said, "Hey, Janet, I'm sorry you got yelled at during reading. It was my fault. I was the one who did that sound." "You did?" said Janet. "But how come Mrs. Avery thought it was me?" So Nick told her about the blackbirds, and Janet thought it was pretty interesting. Then she tried making a beep or 2 on her own, and Janet's chirps were even higher and squeakier than Nick's. She promised to keep everything a secret. For the rest of Nick's 4th grade year, at least once a week, Mrs. Avery heard a loud beep from somewhere in her classroom. Sometimes a chirp, sometimes a very high-pitched chirp. Mrs. Avery never figured out who was making that sound, and gradually she trained herself to ignore it, but she still looked like a hawk. To Nick, the whole thing was just one long and successful science experiment, and Janet Fisk enjoyed it too. So we'll read one more chapter. Chapter 2 is called Mrs. Granger. 5th grade was different. That was the year to get ready for middle school. 5th grade meant passing classes. It meant no morning recess. It meant real letter grades on your report cards. But most of all, it meant Mrs. Granger. There were about 150 kids in 5th grade, and there were 7 Fifth grade teachers, 2 math, 2 science, 2 social studies, but only 1 language arts teacher. In language arts, Mrs. Granger had a monopoly and a reputation. Mrs. Granger lived alone in a tidy little house in the older part of town. She drove an old pale blue car to school every morning, rain or shine, snow or sleet, hail or wind. She had a perfect attendance record that stretched back farther than any of the kids could remember. Her hair was almost white, swept away from her face, up into something like a nest in the back of her head. She never wore pants to school. She had 2 skirt and jacket outfits, her gray uniform and her blue uniform, which she always wore over a white shirt with a little cameo pinned at the neck. And Mrs. Granger was one of those people who never wore sweats. It had to be who never sweats. It had to be over 90 degrees before she even took off her jacket. She was small as teachers go. There were even some 5th graders who were taller than her, but Mrs. Granger seemed like a giant. It was her eyes that did it. They were dark gray, as if they turned them on full power and they could make you feel like a speck of dust. Her eyes could twinkle and laugh too, and kids said she could crack real funny jokes, but it wasn't the jokes that made her famous. Everyone was sure that Mrs. Granger had X-ray vision. Don't even think about chewing a piece of gum within 50 feet of her. If you did, Mrs. Granger would come and see and catch you and make sure you stick that gum into the bright yellow index card. And then she would safety pin that card to the front of your shirt. And you'd have to wear that chewed up bubble gum for the rest of the school day. After that, you had to take it home and have your mom or dad sign the card and bring it back to her class the next day. And it didn't matter to Mrs. Granger if you weren't in 5th grade, because the way she saw it, sooner or later, you'd be hers. All the kids at Lincoln Elementary School knew that at the end of the line, 5th grade, Mrs. Granger would be the one grading their spelling test and their reading test. And worst of all, their vocabulary tests, week after week, month after month. Every language arts teacher in the world enjoys making kids use the dictionary. Check your spelling, check the definition, check the syllable breaks. But Mrs. Granger didn't just enjoy the dictionary. She loved the dictionary, almost worshipped it. Her weekly vocabulary list was 35 words long, sometimes longer. Can you guys imagine having to memorize 35 vocab words every week? As if that wasn't bad enough, there was a word of the day on the blackboard every day. And if you gave yourself a day off and didn't write that one down and look it up and learn the definition, sooner or later Mrs. Granger would find out. And then, just for you, there'd be 2 words of the day for an entire week. So here's a picture of Mrs. Granger. She looks like such a lovely lady. Mrs. Granger kept a full set of 30 dictionaries on a shelf at the back of the room, but her pride and joy was one of those huge dictionaries with every word in the universe in it, the kind of book it takes 2 kids to carry. It sat on its own little table at the front of her classroom, sort of like the altar at the front of the church. Every graduate of Lincoln Elementary School for the past 35 years every graduate could remember standing at the table listening to Mrs. Granger's battle cry, "Look it up! Look it up! That's why we have a dictionary!" Even before the school year started, when it was still the summer before 5th grade, for Nick and his friends, Mrs. Granger was already busy. Every parent of every new 5th grader got a letter from her. Nick's mom read part of it out loud during dinner one night in August. Every home is expected to have a good dictionary in it so that each student can do his or her homework properly. Can you imagine if we said you guys all had to have a dictionary at home to do your homework? Good spelling and good grammar and good word skills are essential for every student. Clear thinking requires a command of the English language, and 5th grade is the ideal time for every girl and every boy to acquire an expanded vocabulary. And then there was a list of the dictionaries that Mrs. Granger thought would be acceptable for home studies. Mrs. Allen said, "It's so nice to have a teacher who takes her work this seriously." Nick groaned and tried to enjoy the rest of his hamburger, but even watermelon for dessert didn't cheer him up too much. Nick had no particular use for a dictionary. He liked words a lot, he was good at using them, but he figured that he got all the words he needed just by reading, and he read all the time. When Nick ran into a word he didn't know, he asked his brother or his dad or whoever was around what it meant, and if they knew, they'd tell him, but if not, Mrs. Granger. He had heard all about her. He had seen 5th graders in the library last year, noses stuck in their dictionary, frantically trying to finish their vocabulary sheets before English class. It was still a week before school, and Nick already felt like 5th grade was going to be a very long year. So that is the end of chapter 2, and we will pick up on Monday with chapter 3, the question.